Doctors, what happened during your shift that made international news? I was finishing my overnight ER shift at 6 a.m. when I heard screaming from the parking lot. I ran outside. A woman was dragging her teenage daughter from a van. The girl was unconscious, barely breathing, foam around her mouth. "Please," the mother was sobbing. "She took pills, lots of pills. She's dying." We rushed her inside. The girl, Maya, 15 years old, was in critical condition. Overdose, clearly intentional. We pumped her stomach, started IV fluids, pushed Narcan. Her vitals were crashing. "What did she take?" I asked the mother while working. "Everything in our medicine cabinet. Xanax, oxycodone, Ambien, maybe 30 pills." "When?" 2 hours ago. I found her note and rushed here. 2 hours was bad, really bad. The drugs were already absorbed. Her organs were shutting down. As we worked, Maya briefly became conscious. She grabbed my coat weakly. "Let me die," she whispered. "Please, just let me go. Maya, we're helping you. You don't understand what he did to me, what he's going to keep doing. Please." She coded. We started CPR, got her back. But she kept coding, like her body was fighting to die. The mother was pacing on her phone. "She's crazy, making up stories. Her stepfather would never—" I froze, looked at the bruises on Maya's arms I'd attributed to the fall, the old scars on her thighs, the way she flinched when male nurses touched her. "Ma'am, has Maya made accusations about her stepfather?" "Lies! All lies! She's jealous of our marriage!" Maya coded again, this time for 3 minutes. We got her back, but she was hanging by a thread. That's when a man burst into the ER. Expensive suit, demanding. "Where's my daughter?" "The stepfather. Richard Brennan." I recognized him. City councilman, owned half the businesses downtown. He tried to push past me into the trauma room. "You can't go in there. That's my daughter. Stepdaughter, and she's critical." He grabbed my arm. "She took pills because she's mentally ill. We're taking her to a private facility when she's stable. She's not going anywhere except psychiatric hold." His face darkened. "I own this hospital's board. You want to keep your job?" Security footage later showed what happened next. Richard shoved me. I shoved back. He pulled what looked like a weapon from his pocket. Turned out to be a phone, but in the moment, security tackled him. While security held him, his phone fell. The screen was open to messages. I saw them clearly. Photos. Of Maya. Unconscious. Undressed. Dozens of them. I screenshot everything with my phone before security let him up. Richard straightened his suit. "She's coming home with us." "No, she's not." I called police right there, showed them the screenshots. Richard tried to run. Security held him until cops arrived. But here's where it gets worse. When police searched his phone, they found videos. Not just of Maya. 14 other girls. All his daughter's friends. All drugged at sleepovers at his house. Maya survived. Barely. When she woke up 3 days later and learned Richard was arrested, she broke down. "You saved me," she said. "Not from the pills. From him." The case exploded internationally because Richard wasn't just a councilman. He was running for governor. His campaign was built on protecting children and family values. He'd passed laws requiring parental consent for teen medical care, laws that would have given him legal control over Maya's treatment. At trial, they found his network. 12 other men, prominent, judges, police chiefs, businessmen, all sharing videos of their own daughters and stepdaughters. Maya testified via video link. She was the first. Then 30 other girls came forward. The youngest was 9. But the part that haunts me? The mother knew. Maya's mother knew the whole time. She was taking payment from the other men to drug Maya for them. When police arrested her, she screamed at me, "You ruined everything. We were getting rich. She's just a stupid girl." The trial became the largest child trafficking case in U.S. history. 43 arrests, including 2 judges who'd been throwing out cases against each other. Maya's in witness protection now. She sends me letters sometimes. In the last one, she wrote, "You're the first adult who believed me, who fought for me. Thank you for not letting me die that night." But here's what nobody knows. The FBI found something else on Richard's computer. A list of hospitals. Doctors who could be convinced to let certain patients die. My name was being added the night Maya came in. I got home around 8 a.m. and collapsed on my couch. My phone rang 2 hours later. I didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway because I was too tired to care. A man's voice came through, clipped and urgent. He said he was calling from the FBI field office and needed me to come in immediately. I asked what this was about. He paused for just a second, then said they'd found something else on Richard's computer. Something I needed to see in person. The way he said it made my stomach drop. I told him I'd be there in an hour. I drove to the federal building downtown, showed my ID at security, and got escorted to the third floor. A man in his 40s met me in the hallway. He had graying hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He introduced himself as Edward Morgan and shook my hand. He led me into a small conference room with no windows. A laptop sat open on the table. Edward gestured for me to sit, then turned the screen toward me. I saw a spreadsheet file. The title at the top read, Hospital Contacts, in plain black text. My name was there. Third row down. Next to it were dates, dollar amounts, and a column labeled Status. I stared at my name for a long moment. Edward sat across from me and folded his hands on the table. He said they believed Richard was building a network of medical professionals, doctors who could be bribed or blackmailed into letting certain patients die. My name had been added the night Maya came in. There was a note in the comments column next to my entry. It said, Refused cooperation. Assess vulnerability. I felt my hands go cold. Edward kept talking, explaining how they thought it worked. Richard would identify doctors who treated abuse victims. He'd approach them with money first, then move to threats if that didn't work. The goal was to have people in hospitals who could make deaths look natural, cover up evidence, make problems disappear. I sat there trying to process what he was telling me. I'd been evaluated, assessed like a potential asset. Richard had looked at me that night in the ER and decided whether I could be bought or threatened into helping him. I'd been one decision away from ending up on the wrong side of this whole thing. The thought made me sick. My hands started shaking. Edward noticed and pushed a bottle of water across the table toward me. I drank half of it in one go. He waited until I looked steadier, then said they wanted to put me in witness protection. I shook my head immediately. I told him I couldn't abandon my ER patients. He argued that Richard's network might try to retaliate. I said I understood the risk, but I wasn't disappearing. Edward studied me for a minute, then nodded. He said they'd assign me a security detail instead. 2 agents would shadow me at work and home until they were certain the network couldn't get to me. I asked how long that would take. He said weeks, maybe months, depending on how many arrests they made. I agreed and signed some paperwork. Edward walked me out and introduced me to the 2 agents who'd be following me around. They looked like they could handle trouble. I went back to the hospital for my next shift 3 days later. People looked at me differently. Some nurses smiled and nodded like I'd done something brave. Others avoided eye contact and found reasons to be in different parts of the ER when I walked by. I was checking a patient's chart when someone tapped my shoulder. Irving Schaefer stood behind me. He was a board member, late 50s, always wore expensive suits. He suggested we talk in private. We went to an empty consultation room. Irving closed the door and leaned against it. He said the board was concerned about my well-being. The media attention was intense. Maybe I should take a leave of absence. Get some rest. Let things calm down. I looked at him and saw exactly what this was. They wanted me gone while they managed their PR crisis. Irving kept talking about how stressful this must be for me, how I deserved time to recover. I cut him off. I said I wasn't taking leave. I was fine, and my patients needed me. Irving's face changed. The fake concern disappeared. He straightened up and adjusted his tie. He mentioned that my contract was up for renewal in 6 months. Just something to keep in mind. Then he left. I stood there for a minute feeling the weight of that threat. They were going to fire me. Not now, not publicly, but in 6 months, when people weren't paying attention anymore. Zane found me in the parking lot during my break. He was the closest thing I had to a friend in this place. We'd worked together for 3 years. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee. We drove to a place 2 blocks away and sat in a corner booth. Zane stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. He said he was worried about me. The board was furious about all the media attention. They were looking for ways to distance the hospital from the scandal. He'd heard them talking about it in meetings. I asked if they'd said anything specific about me. Zane nodded. They were building a case, documenting everything they could use to justify not renewing my contract. He told me to be careful. Don't give them anything they could twist against me. I thanked him, and we finished our coffee in silence. Maya woke up on day 4. I was doing rounds when her nurse paged me. I went to her room and found her sitting up in bed, looking small and scared. She saw me, and her first words were asking if Richard was really arrested, or if she'd dreamed it. I pulled a chair next to her bed and told her it was real. He was in federal custody. The photos and videos had been found. He wasn't getting out. Maya's face crumpled. She started crying and couldn't stop for 20 minutes. But these weren't sad tears. They were relief. Pure, overwhelming relief that made her whole body shake. I sat there and let her cry it out. When she finally calmed down, She asked what happened to her mother. I told her the truth. Her mother had been arrested too. Maya nodded like she'd expected that. She said she'd known for a while that her mother was involved. She just hadn't wanted to believe it. A woman arrived later that afternoon. She introduced herself as Clara Ingram, a victim advocate assigned to Maya's case. Clara had kind eyes and spoke softly. She sat down with Maya and explained witness protection, how it worked, what it meant, where Maya might go. Maya listened, but I could see the fear growing on her face. She asked if she'd have to leave everything behind. Clara said yes. New name, new city, new school, no contact with anyone from her old life. Maya looked at me. She asked if she'd ever see me again. Clara answered before I could. She said probably not. That was how witness protection worked. Maya started crying again. She said she was scared of leaving, but more scared of Richard's network finding her. She'd heard what they did to people who talked. Clara promised her that wouldn't happen. The FBI was making arrests across 3 states. Most of the network would be in prison soon, but Maya needed to be somewhere safe while that happened. Maya agreed, but she looked lost, like she was drowning and couldn't find anything solid to hold on to. Clara left the next morning to start setting up Maya's transfer. I went home and crashed for 6 hours, then woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. 47 missed calls. I scrolled through them. Most were numbers I didn't recognize. A few were reporters. 3 were from my mom asking if I was okay because she'd seen something on the news. I turned on the TV while making coffee. The local station was running a story about Richard's arrest. They showed footage of him being led out in handcuffs. Then they cut to the anchor talking about how an unnamed hospital employee had discovered evidence during the incident. Except, they didn't keep me unnamed for long. 10 seconds later, my face filled the screen. An old photo from the hospital website. My full name underneath. The anchor explained how I'd been treating Maya when I found photos on Richard's phone. She made it sound heroic, but all I could think about was how exposed I suddenly felt. I checked my social media. My accounts were set to private, but people were still finding ways to contact me. Messages from strangers, some thanking me, others calling me a liar, saying Richard was framed. Someone had posted my home address in a comment thread on a news article. Just put it right there for anyone to see. I felt my chest tighten. By evening, the calls hadn't stopped. I turned my phone off and tried to eat dinner but couldn't finish it. Every car that drove past my apartment made me look out the window. Edward showed up at my door around 9 that night with another agent. He apologized for the intrusion, but said they needed to move me somewhere safe while they figured out the threat level. I packed a bag and followed them to a hotel across town. They got me a room on the 4th floor and stationed someone in the hallway. The agent told me to keep the curtains closed and not to answer the door for anyone except them. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. The room was generic, beige everything, a painting of a beach that looked like it came from a furniture store. I tried to sleep but kept hearing footsteps in the hallway. Each time someone walked past, I tensed up, waiting to see if they'd stop at my door. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and turned on the TV with the volume low. Some old movie I'd seen before. I watched it without really paying attention. The second night was worse. I'd been awake so long that every shadow looked wrong. The air conditioning unit made a clicking sound that set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about that list. My name being added. Doctors who could be convinced to let certain patients die. I wondered how many others were on it. How many had already been approached. The third night, I finally slept a few hours out of pure exhaustion. Adriana Silva came to see me on the 4th day. She knocked and identified herself through the door before I opened it. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back tight. She shook my hand and got straight to business. She sat across from me at the small table by the window and opened a folder. She explained the case timeline. Arraignment was already done. Richard was being held without bail because of flight risk. Preliminary hearing would be in 3 weeks. Trial probably wouldn't start for 6 months. She looked at me directly when she said Richard's legal team would come after me hard. She said destroying my credibility was their best defense strategy. They'd dig into my background, question my judgment, imply I had ulterior motives. She asked if there was anything in my past they could use. Any complaints, any disciplinary actions, anything at all. I told her about a malpractice lawsuit from 3 years ago. A patient who'd had a bad reaction to medication. It got dismissed because I'd followed protocol exactly, but it was still on record. Adriana wrote that down and said they'd definitely bring it up. She asked about my personal life, relationships, finances, anything that could be twisted. I told her there wasn't much to tell. No spouse, no kids, student loans like everyone else. She seemed satisfied with that. Before she left, She told me to stay away from media. Don't give interviews, don't post on social media, don't respond to anything. Let the evidence speak for itself. 2 days after that meeting, I was back in my apartment watching TV when Tucker Armstrong appeared on screen. Richard's attorney. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of guy who probably practiced his concerned expression in the mirror. He was on one of those cable news shows with a host who loved controversy. Tucker talked about how his client was innocent, how this was a rush to judgment, how the real story wasn't being told. Then he started talking about me. He didn't use my name, but he didn't have to. He said the doctor who made the accusations had assaulted Richard first, that the phone evidence was questionable because I'd had time to manipulate what I photographed. He suggested I might be seeking attention or have some personal issue with successful men. The host asked if he was saying I fabricated evidence. Tucker gave this careful answer about how he wasn't accusing anyone of anything specific, but the circumstances were suspicious and deserved scrutiny. I sat there feeling my hands shake. Everything in me wanted to call that show, to defend myself, to explain what actually happened. Instead, I grabbed my keys and went to my car. I drove to the hospital even though my shift didn't start for hours. I just needed to move, to do something. I parked in my usual spot and sat there trying to calm down. My phone rang. Zane. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I answered. He asked where I was. I told him the parking lot. He said he'd be right down. 5 minutes later, he opened my passenger door and got in. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there while I gripped the steering wheel. Finally, he asked if I'd seen the interview. I nodded. He said he figured I had based on how I looked. He told me not to do anything stupid. I asked what he thought I was going to do. He said he didn't know, but he recognized that look. The one where someone's about to make things worse for themselves because they're angry. He reminded me that responding publicly was exactly what Richard's team wanted. They wanted me emotional, defensive, making mistakes. He said the best thing I could do was nothing. Just let Adriana handle it. I knew he was right, but it didn't make the anger go away. We sat there for another 10 minutes before he had to get back inside. He made me promise I'd go home and not do anything rash. I promised. Edward called me the next morning with news. 2 more girls from Maya's school had come forward. Both had similar stories about Richard. One said he'd given her drinks at a party that made her feel weird, and she'd woken up in his guest room with no memory of how she got there. The other described being at a sleepover at Maya's house, where Richard had insisted they take medication he said was for allergies, and after that, everything got blurry. Edward said their testimony would back up Maya's account. It established a pattern, multiple victims with consistent details. That was huge for prosecution. I asked if the girls were okay. He said they were scared, but determined to tell the truth. Their parents were cooperating fully. He mentioned they'd also found financial records showing Richard had been paying several people, including Maya's mother. The money trail was solid. 3 days later, Edward called again. One of the new victims, a 14-year-old girl, had told investigators something that changed everything. Her father was a police captain, and according to her, he was part of Richard's network. She'd overheard conversations, seen her father on his computer late at night looking at things he shouldn't have been looking at. The FBI had already started investigating him quietly, but now they had direct testimony. Edward said they were realizing the conspiracy went deeper into law enforcement than they'd initially thought. If a police captain was involved, who else might be? How many investigations had been buried? How many reports had disappeared? They were going back through years of records looking for patterns. I asked what would happen to the girl. Edward said she and her mother were being moved to a safe location. The mother had no idea about the father's involvement and was cooperating completely. They'd arrest the captain soon, but they were timing it carefully to maximize impact and prevent others from fleeing. The arrest happened 4 days later. I heard about it from the news before Edward called. They did it at the precinct during shift change. Maximum visibility. Video showed the captain being led out in handcuffs past dozens of his fellow officers. Some looked shocked. Others looked away. The footage went viral within hours. National news picked it up. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local scandal about a corrupt politician. It was a story about systemic abuse in positions of power, about law enforcement protecting predators. The media coverage exploded. Every major outlet wanted a piece of it. Richard's campaign, his political allies, the police department, the judicial system, everything was under scrutiny. I watched it unfold from my apartment, feeling both vindicated and overwhelmed. This was so much bigger than I'd realized that night in the ER. I went back to work the next day. I pulled into the hospital parking lot and immediately saw the crowd. Maybe 100 people with signs. Half of them were supporting me. "Thank you for protecting children. Heroes work here. Justice for Maya. The other half had signs calling me a liar. Innocent, until proven guilty. Stop the witch hunt. Political hit job. Security was trying to keep them separated, but both groups were loud. I sat in my car for a minute trying to figure out how to get inside. My phone rang. Hospital security. They said they'd meet me at the side entrance and escort me in. I drove around to the employee entrance where 2 security guards were waiting. They walked on either side of me as we headed toward the door. Someone from the protest crowd spotted us. Within seconds, both groups were pushing toward us. People screaming, cameras in my face, questions being shouted. The guards kept moving and got me inside. I could still hear the noise through the doors. Irving was waiting in the hallway. He said he needed to see me in his office immediately. I followed him upstairs. 2 other board members were already there. A woman I recognized from the hospital events, and a man I'd never met. They all had the same serious expression. Irving gestured for me to sit. He said they'd called this meeting to discuss the situation. He used that word, situation. Like what was happening outside was just an inconvenience. He talked about how the hospital was receiving pressure from multiple directions. Donors were concerned. Patients were asking questions. Staff morale was affected. The woman jumped in and said they understood I'd acted with good intentions, but the reality was, my involvement had created significant complications for the institution. The man I didn't know said they'd decided to place me on administrative leave, pending an internal review of my conduct during Richard's arrest. Paid leave, he emphasized, like that made it better. Irving said it was temporary, just until things calmed down. I asked what exactly they were reviewing. Irving said they needed to examine whether I'd followed proper protocols, whether my actions had exposed the hospital to liability, whether I'd handled the situation appropriately. It was all bureaucratic language that meant nothing. I could see what this actually was. They were building a case to fire me once the media attention died down. I left Irving's office knowing exactly what was happening. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves. Richard had donated hundreds of thousands to this hospital over the years. His network included people on the board. They needed me gone but couldn't fire me outright without looking guilty. So they'd build a paper trail, document concerns, create justification, then let me go quietly once the media moved on to the next story. I walked back to the ER in a daze. My phone buzzed. Zane texting me to meet him in the break room. When I got there, he had his laptop open and a weird look on his face. He turned the screen toward me. It was a petition, a simple document stating that the ER staff supported my actions and believed I'd acted with integrity. 60 signatures already. Nurses, techs, other doctors, people I worked with every day. I felt something crack in my chest. These people were risking their jobs for me. But Zane's face wasn't celebratory. He scrolled down to show me the full staff list. 150 people worked in our ER. 60 had signed. That meant 90 hadn't. 40% of my colleagues either thought I was wrong or wouldn't risk supporting me publicly. I thanked Zane, but the math sat heavy in my stomach. More than half the people I worked alongside every day were willing to stand with me, but almost half weren't. 3 days later, Clara called. Maya was moved. The FBI had arranged a safe house 3 states away while they prepared for trial. She'd be there with 2 other girls from the case, all under federal protection. Clara said Maya wanted me to have something. She met me in the hospital parking lot and handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful teenage handwriting. It thanked me for being the first adult who believed her, for fighting when everyone else wanted her to stay quiet, for saving her life even when she'd begged me not to. I read it twice sitting in my car. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my locker at work. On the days when Irving's pressure got bad, or the protesters got loud, or my colleagues looked away in the hallway, I'd open my locker and see that envelope. Remember why any of this mattered. Edward called me at home on a Tuesday night. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. They'd found more. His tech team had been doing forensic analysis on Richard's network, tracing shared files, following financial transactions. They'd identified 10 more men, all connected through encrypted messages and wire transfers, all sharing the same type of content. The arrests were happening simultaneously across 3 states. Coordinated timing so nobody could warn anyone else. Nobody could run. He said it would hit the news in the morning but wanted me to know first. I asked how many total now. He said with these 10, they were up to 32 arrests. The number kept growing. The news broke at 6 a.m. I watched it before my shift. 10 men arrested in coordinated raids. The footage showed FBI agents at multiple locations, houses in 3 different states. One of the men was a family court judge. That detail made my stomach turn. A judge who decided custody cases. who ruled on abuse allegations. The FBI discovered he'd been dismissing cases for years. 17 cases involving victims of network members. 17 kids who'd tried to get help through the legal system and been shut down by someone who was part of the same network abusing them. The reporter said investigators were reviewing every case he'd ever handled, looking for patterns, looking for more victims who'd been silenced. 2 days later, Adriana held a press conference. I watched it live on my phone during a break at work. She stood at a podium with the FBI seal behind her. Her voice was steady and professional as she laid out the scope. 43 total arrests across multiple states. A trafficking conspiracy that had operated for at least 8 years. Victims ranging from age 9 to 17. She called it one of the largest child trafficking cases in U.S. history. Then she said something that made everyone in the break room look at me. She thanked alert medical professionals who'd recognized warning signs and taken action. She didn't use my name, but everyone knew. The nurses sitting near me nodded. One squeezed my shoulder as she walked past. Tucker Armstrong filed his motion 3 weeks after Richard's arrest. Adriana called to warn me it was coming. He was arguing that the phone evidence should be suppressed, that I had no legal authority to photograph Richard's private communications, that it was an illegal search. Adriana spent the next week buried in legal research, preparing arguments about plain view doctrine, about how evidence visible during a lawful detention doesn't require a warrant, about how Richard's phone was unlocked and in clear sight during a physical altercation where he appeared to be reaching for a weapon. She called me every night to talk through scenarios, what I'd seen, what I'd thought in that moment, what made me grab my phone and start taking pictures. The hearing was on a Friday. I sat in the back of the courtroom while lawyers argued over my split-second decision. Tucker stood up and painted me as reckless, overstepping, acting like a vigilante instead of a doctor. Adriana countered with security footage showing Richard's aggressive behavior, showing his phone falling during the altercation, showing the screen clearly visible and unlocked. The judge took 2 days to rule. When the decision came down, Adriana called me immediately. The evidence was admissible. The judge agreed that Richard's phone was in plain view during a situation where I reasonably believed he might be armed. That photographing visible evidence during an emergency didn't constitute an illegal search. It was a huge victory. But Tucker promised to appeal, said he'd take it all the way up if necessary. I returned to work after 3 weeks of administrative leave. The hospital's lawyers had determined that firing me would create liability given the circumstances, that it would look like retaliation, that it would suggest the hospital sided with Richard over abuse victims. So they brought me back. Irving called me into his office my first day. He said I could return to my normal duties, that the internal review had concluded. But then he leaned back in his chair and made something very clear. My contract was up for renewal in 6 months, and the hospital wouldn't be renewing it. He used careful language, talked about restructuring, about budgets, about moving in new directions. But the message was obvious. I could work the next 6 months. Then I was done. That same week, Richard's wife filed for divorce. She gave an interview to a major news network, sat in her expensive living room and cried for the cameras, said she'd had no idea what her husband was doing, that she was shocked and betrayed, that she never would have allowed such things in her home. Edward called me after it aired, said not to believe a word. They were investigating her too, looking at her bank accounts, her phone records, her movements. But she was cooperating, giving them information in exchange for immunity, helping them build cases against other network members. He said it made him sick, but sometimes that's how it worked. You made deals with people who didn't deserve them to get the ones who deserved it more. The news coverage brought 6 more girls forward over the next 2 weeks. Edward called me each time another victim came in to give a statement. Ages 9 to 16. Each interview followed the same pattern. They remembered going to sleepovers at Richard's house. They remembered eating snacks or drinking sodas. Then nothing, until they woke up hours later feeling sick and confused. Some found bruises they couldn't explain. Others just knew something was wrong, but couldn't say what. The youngest was 9 years old when it started. She told investigators she thought she was dreaming when she saw the camera flash. She's 12 now, and only came forward after seeing Maya's case on the news. Edward's tech specialist spent 3 weeks analyzing file metadata on Richard's computer. The results came back while I was working a night shift. Edward called me at 2 a.m., and I stepped outside the ER to take it. The operation ran for at least 8 years, based on the earliest file dates. 8 years of systematic abuse documented in thousands of photos and videos. The tech specialist found files dating back to when Maya was 7 years old. 7. Richard had been abusing her since she was in 2nd grade. The specialist also recovered deleted files showing Richard had been careful about covering his tracks. He used encrypted folders and cloud storage accounts under fake names, but he got sloppy near the end, started keeping more files on his personal devices. That sloppiness saved lives because it gave investigators everything they needed. My phone rang 3 days later while I was grocery shopping. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Clara's voice came through when I picked up. She said Maya wanted to talk to me, and they'd arranged a special exception to witness protection protocols. The line clicked, and Maya's voice replaced Clara's. She sounded different from the last time I'd heard her. Stronger somehow. More present. She told me she was doing better. Going to therapy 3 times a week. Learning to paint. Making friends at her new school. But then her voice got quieter. She said she still has nightmares every single night. Dreams where Richard finds her. Dreams where no one believes her. Dreams where she's back in that house and can't get out. She takes medication to sleep now. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it doesn't. She thanked me again for saving her life. I told her she saved herself by being brave enough to testify. She laughed, but it sounded sad. She said she didn't feel brave. She felt scared all the time. We talked for 10 more minutes before Clara came back on and said they needed to end the call. I stood in the cereal aisle afterward, holding my phone and trying not to cry. Tucker's team started digging into my background the following week. I knew it was coming, but it still felt invasive watching it happen. They pulled my medical school records, my employment history, my financial statements, looking for anything they could use to make me look incompetent or unstable or biased. They found a malpractice lawsuit from 3 years ago. A patient's family had sued after their father died from complications during surgery. The case was dismissed within 6 months because the death resulted from the patient's pre-existing conditions, not medical error. But Tucker's team leaked it to friendly media outlets anyway. Suddenly, reporters were calling it a pattern of questionable judgment, asking if the hospital should have flagged my record earlier, implying I had a history of making poor decisions under pressure. The articles started running 2 days later. I saw them on my phone during a break between patients. Headlines questioning my medical competence. Sidebar photos showing me looking exhausted after a shift with captions about my checkered history. One article spent 6 paragraphs rehashing the dismissed lawsuit and only mentioned in passing that it had been thrown out. Zane found me in the break room staring at my phone. He sat down across from me without saying anything at first. Then he pulled out his own phone and showed me the same articles. He'd been reading them too. I could see something in his face. Not doubt exactly, but calculation. Like he was weighing whether supporting me was worth the professional risk. We'd been friends for 4 years, worked hundreds of shifts together, covered for each other during emergencies and personal crises. But I watched him do the math in real time, figuring out if loyalty to me would damage his own career. He told me he believed I'd done the right thing, but his voice had this careful quality, like he was already distancing himself just in case. Richard's campaign manager turned state's evidence that same week. Adriana called to tell me they'd offered him a deal in exchange for full cooperation. He provided emails showing Richard had deliberately built his family values platform to deflect suspicion. Every speech about protecting children, every photo op at schools and youth centers, every law he'd pushed requiring parental consent for medical care. All of it calculated to create a public image so wholesome that accusations would seem impossible. The emails laid it out clearly. Richard's campaign manager had even written strategy memos about using the platform as insurance, making Richard so associated with child protection that any allegations would look like political attacks. The hypocrisy became a national talking point within hours. News outlets ran side-by-side comparisons of Richard's campaign speeches and the charges against him. Social media exploded with people sharing clips of him talking about family values while knowing what he'd been doing to Maya and the others. Adriana started offering plea deals to lower-level network members 2 weeks later. She called me to explain the strategy. They needed testimony from people inside the network to build airtight cases against Richard and the other ringleaders. 8 men accepted deals over the next 10 days. Each one agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced sentences. Adriana said it made her sick giving these men any kind of break, but she needed their testimony to guarantee convictions on the top targets. The cooperating witnesses provided details about how the network operated, how they shared files through encrypted channels, how they recruited new members, how they identified vulnerable targets. Each piece of testimony added to the mountain of evidence against Richard. One of the cooperating witnesses revealed something that made everything worse. He told investigators that Natalie wasn't just enabling Richard's abuse of Maya. She'd been actively recruiting other mothers and daughters into the network for money. She'd identified single mothers struggling financially, befriended them, gained their trust, then introduced them to Richard and the others as business opportunities. She'd frame it as modeling or pageant preparation, convince the mothers their daughters could make money, then deliver those girls to the network. Investigators found records showing she'd recruited at least 6 other families, 6 mothers who'd sold access to their own daughters. The witness provided bank records showing payments flowing from network members to Natalie's accounts, thousands of dollars per transaction. The FBI arrested Natalie on additional charges 3 days after that testimony, conspiracy and human trafficking charges on top of the child abuse charges she already faced. Adriana said they confronted her with the financial evidence during interrogation. Natalie tried to claim Richard had manipulated her, that she'd been afraid of him, that she didn't understand what was happening. But the bank records told a different story. Over $200,000 deposited into her accounts over 8 years, regular payments after each incident, detailed notes in her own handwriting about scheduling and logistics. She'd kept records of everything like it was a legitimate business. The evidence made it impossible for her to claim ignorance or coercion. Clara called me 4 days later. Her voice was tight with worry. Maya had learned the full extent of her mother's involvement through news coverage. Clara said Maya had stopped eating, just refused all food for 3 days straight. She'd curl up in bed and stare at the wall, wouldn't talk, wouldn't engage with her therapist, wouldn't do anything except lie there. They'd finally had to hospitalize her when she became dangerously dehydrated. Clara said Maya kept saying the same thing over and over, that her mother had sold her, not just failed to protect her, actually sold her like property. The realization had broken something in Maya that even Richard's arrest hadn't touched, because at least with Richard, she could tell herself her mother didn't know, that her mother had been fooled like everyone else. But now, she knew the truth. Her mother had known everything, had participated willingly, had profited from her daughter's suffering. Clara said they'd stabilized Maya physically, but the emotional damage was profound. She'd need intensive therapy for years, maybe forever. I asked if there was anything I could do. Clara said just keep being someone Maya could trust. Keep being proof that some adults actually protect children instead of exploiting them. I kept my head down and finished the training modules the hospital required. Evidence handling procedures, chain of custody protocols, documentation standards. All of it felt like busy work, designed to create a paper trail showing they'd addressed my supposed deficiencies. I clicked through the slides, took the quizzes, got my completion certificates. The whole process took 3 weeks of online modules during my off hours. Every time I logged in, I thought about how none of this would have mattered if I hadn't taken those screenshots. The hospital wanted to punish me for succeeding, not for failing. 2 days after I completed the training, someone leaked my address again. I was walking out of the federal courthouse after giving a deposition when cameras caught me on the front steps. By evening, my home address was circulating on social media. Tucker's supporters were sharing it with comments about how I deserved to face consequences for ruining Richard's life. The FBI called me at midnight. Someone had spray-painted liar across my apartment door in red letters 3 feet high. My neighbors had called building security when they heard the noise. Edward arranged for agents to move me to a different apartment across town the next morning. I packed everything I owned into boxes, while 2 agents stood guard in my hallway. The building manager wouldn't look at me when I turned in my keys. Edward called me 3 days into my new apartment with an update that made everything worse. His team had found files on Richard's computer showing he'd been planning to expand the operation nationally. Contact lists for 6 other states, names of potential recruits, notes about which cities had the right combination of wealth and corrupt officials to make it work. The FBI was opening parallel investigations in California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and Illinois. Edward said they expected to find more networks, more victims, more men who thought their money and power made them untouchable. He sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before, like he was realizing this case was just one piece of something much bigger and darker. Zane found me in the hospital parking lot the following week. I was sitting in my car after a shift, too exhausted to drive home yet. He knocked on my window and I unlocked the door. He got in the passenger seat and just sat there for a minute before speaking. He'd been offered a department head position at another hospital. Better pay, better hours, actual opportunities for advancement. He was going to take it. I told him congratulations and meant it, but we both knew what he wasn't saying. The environment here had become toxic for anyone associated with me. Other doctors avoided him in the hallways. Nurses whispered when he walked past. The board had made it clear that loyalty to me was a career liability. He felt guilty leaving, but he had a family to support and a career to protect. I shook his hand and told him I understood completely, because I did. 3 more arrests happened the next week, based on testimony from the cooperating witnesses. Edward called to tell me about each one. 2 were businessmen who'd been part of Richard's inner circle. The third was a pediatrician who'd been providing medical cover stories for victims' injuries. He'd examined girls after incidents and written reports, attributing their injuries to sports accidents or rough play. He'd prescribed anxiety medication and sleeping pills that the abusers then used to drug the victims. He'd been using his medical license to enable abuse for at least 5 years. 32 girls had been his patients. 32 times he'd chosen to protect abusers instead of children. That arrest hit me harder than any of the others. I spent my next shift thinking about the death list and how easily I could have ended up like him. Richard had been evaluating me that night in the ER, deciding if I could be bribed or blackmailed into cooperation. If I'd let Maya go home with him, would they have approached me later with money? With threats? Would they have slowly pulled me into their network until I was writing false reports and covering up crimes? I thought about all the small compromises that pediatrician must have made. The first time he lied in a medical report. The first time he prescribed medication he knew would be misused. Each decision probably felt small in the moment, but they added up to 5 years of enabling child abuse. I could have been him if I'd made different choices that night. Adriana called 2 weeks later to start trial preparation. She needed to run me through practice cross-examination sessions. Tucker's legal team would be brutal in trying to shake my testimony. She warned me they'd attack my credibility, my judgment, my motives for getting involved. They'd imply I was seeking fame or had a personal vendetta against Richard. They'd pick apart every detail of that night in the ER, looking for inconsistencies. We spent 4 hours in her office while she fired questions at me like she was trying to break me. She played the role of hostile defense attorney, getting in my face, twisting my words, implying I'd fabricated evidence. By the end, I was exhausted, but she said I'd held up well. She told me to expect the real thing to be 10 times more intense. Maya recorded her video testimony a week after that. Adriana and Clara were both present during the recording at an FBI facility near Maya's witness protection location. Adriana called me afterward, and her voice had that tight quality it got when she was trying to stay professional while processing something difficult. She said Maya had been incredibly strong during the testimony. She'd answered every question clearly and directly. She'd described years of abuse in specific detail without breaking down, but Adriana said the trauma was evident in every word Maya spoke. The way her voice went flat when describing certain incidents, the way she stared at a spot on the wall instead of looking at the camera, the way her hands shook even though her voice stayed steady. Clara had held Maya's hand through most of it. Adriana said the jury would see the video and there wouldn't be a dry eye in the courtroom. Richard's trial began 6 months after Maya's overdose. The date arrived faster than I expected, but also felt like it had taken forever. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters when I arrived. Some were holding signs supporting the victims. Others were holding signs defending Richard and calling the whole case a conspiracy. Police had set up barriers to keep the 2 groups separated. I had to enter through a secure entrance with my FBI security detail because Edward's team had received credible threats against my life. 2 agents walked me through a side door and up a back staircase while protesters screamed outside. I could hear them through the walls. Some were chanting my name. I couldn't tell if they were supporting me or threatening me. I testified for 4 hours about the night Maya came in. Adriana walked me through every detail systematically, finding Maya unconscious in the parking lot, her mother's initial story, Maya's brief moment of consciousness when she begged me to let her die, Richard bursting into the ER and trying to take Maya home, the physical altercation, his phone falling and the screen showing those photos. My decision to screenshot the evidence before security let him up, calling the police, Richard trying to run. I kept my answers focused on facts and actions, not interpretations or emotions. Tucker tried to rattle me during cross-examination by implying I was seeking fame from the case. He suggested I'd seen an opportunity to become a hero and inserted myself into a family situation that wasn't my concern. He implied the screenshots could have been doctored or taken out of context, but I stayed focused on what I'd actually seen and done that night. The photos on Richard's phone, Maya's injuries, her terror when Richard tried to take her. The facts didn't change no matter how Tucker tried to twist them. Tucker came back at me the next morning with his cross-examination. He stood up from the defense table and walked toward the witness stand slowly. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He started asking about the exact seconds between when Richard's phone hit the floor and when I took the screenshots. He wanted me to walk through every single moment in detail. He asked how long the phone was on the ground. He asked if I picked it up or just leaned over it. He asked if I had time to scroll through the messages before photographing them. His voice stayed steady and professional, but the implication was clear. He was suggesting I had time to stage what I saw, or even doctor the evidence somehow. He kept circling back to those few seconds, asking the same questions in different ways. How many seconds passed? What exactly I was thinking? Whether anyone was watching me? Whether I considered that I might be violating Richard's privacy? I kept my answers short and factual. The phone fell during the struggle. The screen was already unlocked and open to messages. I saw the photos immediately. I photographed what was visible. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. Tucker tried to make it sound like I had plenty of time to fabricate evidence, but the security footage backed up my timeline. Adriana stood for redirect and walked me through the chaos of that moment. She asked about Maya's condition. She asked about Richard trying to force his way into the trauma room. She asked about the physical altercation. She established that I was acting on instinct during an emergency situation, not carefully planning evidence collection. She asked if I had any idea what would be on Richard's phone before it fell. I said no. She asked if I had time to think through the legal implications of photographing it. I said no. She asked what I was thinking in that moment. I said I was thinking that whatever was on that phone was important enough that Richard was willing to get physical to protect it. The redirect lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it was enough to counter Tucker's implications. The courtroom went completely silent when they played Maya's video testimony the next day. The bailiff dimmed the lights, and a large screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. Maya appeared on screen sitting in a plain room with beige walls. She looked smaller than I remembered from the hospital. Her hair was shorter and a different color. She wore a simple blue sweater. Clara sat beside her just outside the camera frame. The prosecutor's questions came from off-screen, and Maya answered each one clearly. Her voice was steady but flat, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. She described the first time Richard came into her room at night when she was 7 years old. She described being given pills that made her feel dizzy and confused. She described waking up the next morning with no memory of the night before, but knowing something bad had happened. She described years of this pattern repeating. She described Richard bringing other men to the house. She described her mother giving her the pills and telling her to be good. She went through specific incidents in clinical detail, stating facts without emotion. She named dates and locations. She described physical details that matched evidence the FBI had already collected. The camera never moved from her face. She stared at a spot on the wall behind the camera the entire time, never making eye contact with the lens. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, but I could see them shaking even though her voice never wavered. Several jurors were crying by the time the video ended. One woman in the front row had tears streaming down her face. A man in the back row kept wiping his eyes. Even the judge looked affected when the lights came back up. Richard sat at the defense table with the same blank expression he'd worn since the trial started. Tucker leaned over and whispered something to him, but Richard didn't respond. The cooperating witnesses testified over the next 3 days. 8 men who had been part of the network took the stand after accepting plea deals. Each one added pieces to the overall picture of how the operation worked. The first witness was a businessman who owned a chain of hotels. He described how Richard recruited him at a fundraiser 3 years ago. He described the private parties where members shared videos. He described the payment structure where fathers received money for providing access to their daughters. The second witness was a police sergeant who had helped cover up complaints. He described getting calls from Richard when victims tried to report abuse. He described making those reports disappear or convincing victims not to pursue charges. The third witness was a lawyer who had handled legal issues for network members. He described creating NDAS for victims' families. He described threatening families with legal action if they spoke publicly. Each witness brought financial records, text messages, emails. The prosecution displayed transaction records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars moving between network members. They showed encrypted chat logs where members discussed logistics and shared files. They showed victim statements that matched what the witnesses described. The evidence was overwhelming. Every piece corroborated every other piece. The financial records matched the communications. The communications matched the victim statements. The victim statements matched the physical evidence. By the third day, Tucker had stopped objecting to most of the evidence. There was simply too much of it, and it all fit together too perfectly. Richard took the stand on day 4 of the trial. Tucker had advised against it according to court observers, but Richard apparently couldn't resist trying to control his own narrative. He wore an expensive suit and sat up straight in the witness chair. His lawyer walked him through his version of events. Richard claimed he was a devoted father and public servant. He claimed Maya had mental health issues and had been making false accusations for years. He claimed the other victims were part of a conspiracy to destroy his political career. He claimed the cooperating witnesses were lying to get reduced sentences. He claimed the financial records were misinterpreted business transactions. He claimed the videos and photos on his phone had been planted by someone with access to his devices. His voice was confident and steady. He made eye contact with the jury. He spoke in the same measured tone he probably used during campaign speeches. He denied everything systematically, offering alternative explanations for each piece of evidence. He suggested I had a personal vendetta against him because he was on the hospital board. He suggested the FBI had fabricated evidence to justify their investigation. He suggested the whole case was politically motivated because he was running for governor. He testified for 2 hours, answering his lawyer's questions calmly and presenting himself as a victim of false accusations and overzealous prosecution. Adriana's cross-examination destroyed him. She started by asking about specific photos found on his phone. She displayed them on the courtroom screens, asking Richard to explain each one. Richard claimed he'd never seen them before. She showed him metadata, proving the photos were taken with his phone. Richard claimed someone else must have used his phone. She showed him text messages he'd sent from that same phone discussing those specific photos. Richard claimed the messages were fabricated. She showed him financial records of payments he'd made to other network members on the same dates mentioned in those messages. Richard claimed the payments were for legitimate business purposes. She asked him to explain what business purposes would involve those specific dollar amounts on those specific dates to those specific people. Richard became defensive, claiming she was twisting innocent transactions. She walked through 6 different instances where his testimony contradicted physical evidence. She showed him video footage from his own security cameras that proved he was lying about his whereabouts on certain dates. She showed him credit card receipts that contradicted his testimony. She showed him phone records that proved he'd called people he claimed not to know. With each contradiction, Richard became more combative. His calm demeanor cracked. He started arguing with her instead of answering questions. He raised his voice. He accused her of harassment. The judge had to tell him twice to just answer the questions. By the end of the cross-examination, Richard looked nothing like the confident public servant who had taken the stand. He looked angry and cornered. His arrogance had worked completely against him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. We waited in a victim services room down the hall from the courtroom. Edward sat with me along with 2 agents from my security detail. Adriana came in twice to update us that the jury had asked for clarification on specific charges and requested to review certain pieces of evidence. She said those were good signs that they were taking the deliberations seriously and working through each count carefully. Around 4 in the afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. The jury filed in and took their seats. None of them looked at Richard. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman said yes. The clerk read the counts one by one. Trafficking, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Child abuse, guilty. Production of child sexual abuse material, guilty. The clerk read through all 16 counts, and the verdict was guilty on every single one. Richard sat perfectly still at the defense table. His face showed nothing. No emotion at all. Tucker put his hand on Richard's shoulder, but Richard didn't react. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. The bailiff led Richard out through the side door. He walked with his head up, still showing no expression. Several people in the gallery started crying. I saw some of the victims' family members holding each other. Edward shook my hand and said this was the outcome Maya deserved. Sentencing happened 2 weeks later on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was packed again with media and family members. Richard was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his suit. The judge went through the sentencing guidelines and aggravating factors. She talked about the number of victims. She talked about Richard's position of trust and authority. She talked about the systematic nature of the abuse. She talked about the harm done to children who should have been protected. She sentenced Richard to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He would be 79 years old before he could even be considered for release. Richard still showed no reaction when the sentence was read. Tucker filed notice that they would appeal, but Adriana told me later that the appeals would almost certainly fail, given how solid the evidence was. Natalie had already been sentenced the week before after pleading guilty to avoid trial. She got 20 years. She'd cried during her sentencing and tried to claim Richard had manipulated her, but the financial records proved she'd been an active and willing participant. The judge hadn't bought her excuses. The other network members were sentenced over the following month. The sentences ranged from 15 to 30 years, depending on how involved each person had been. The police sergeant got 22 years. The businessman got 18 years. The lawyer got 15 years. The family court judge who had been throwing out abuse cases got 30 years, plus permanent disbarment. Every single network member who went to trial was convicted. Every single one who took a plea deal got substantial prison time. Not one of them walked away. The FBI and prosecutor's office held a final press conference announcing that the investigation was closed with 43 successful prosecutions and 0 acquittals. They called it one of the most successful operations against organized child trafficking in U.S. history. Clara called me a few days after all the sentencing was complete. She said Maya wanted to talk to me and asked if I'd be willing to do a phone call. I said yes immediately. Clara connected us, and Maya's voice came through the line. She sounded stronger than the last time we'd talked. She thanked me again for saving her life that night. She said knowing Richard and all the others were in prison helped her sleep better at night. She said she still had nightmares sometimes, but they were getting less frequent. She said her therapist was helping her work through everything. She said she was doing okay in her new school and had made a few friends who didn't know anything about her past. She said she was learning to paint, and it helped her express things she couldn't put into words. She talked for about 10 minutes, and I mostly just listened. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. She said she was glad she didn't die that night, because now she got to see Richard lose everything, like he'd taken everything from her. She said that felt like justice. The hospital declined to renew my contract 3 weeks later. Irving called me into his office with the hospital administrator present. They said the decision was part of organizational restructuring. They said my position was eliminated due to budget constraints. They said it had nothing to do with the trial or my testimony, but I knew exactly what it was. Irving had promised months ago that I'd pay for the embarrassment I'd caused the hospital. This was him keeping that promise. It still hurt, though. I'd worked in that ER for 6 years. I'd saved lives there. I'd built relationships with colleagues and staff. And now I was pushed out because I'd done the right thing. The administrator handed me a severance package and said my last day would be in 2 weeks. I walked out of that office feeling angry and betrayed, but also oddly relieved. I didn't want to work for people who valued their political connections more than protecting kids anyway. I spent the next week sending out resumes and making phone calls to other hospitals in the area. Most places were polite but distant when they heard my name. A few interviews got scheduled but then mysteriously canceled. Word had spread about what happened at my old hospital, and nobody wanted to hire someone who'd caused that kind of trouble for their board. Zane called me on a Thursday morning and told me his new hospital was looking for an ER doctor. He'd already talked to the department head about me. The guy specifically wanted to hire me because of what I'd done during the case. He respected that I'd put a patient's safety above politics and money. I drove out there the next day for an interview. The hospital was smaller than my old one, located in a suburb about 30 minutes outside the city. The ER had 12 beds instead of 24. The department head was a woman in her 50s who shook my hand firmly and told me she'd followed the trial closely. She offered me the position right there in her office. The pay was slightly less than before, but I didn't care. I accepted immediately. Edward called me a few days before I started my new job. He said the FBI was officially closing the investigation. 43 successful prosecutions, 0 acquittals. Every single person they'd arrested had either been convicted at trial or taken a plea deal. He thanked me for my cooperation throughout the whole process. He said my actions that night in the ER had saved dozens of potential future victims. Richard's network had been planning to expand to 6 other states. If I hadn't stopped him when I did, hundreds more girls might have been hurt. Edward's voice got quieter when he said that last part. He told me I should be proud of what I'd done, even though it cost me so much. Then he hung up, and I sat there in my apartment staring at my phone for a long time. My first day at the new hospital was strange. Some of my new colleagues treated me like I was some kind of hero. They'd introduce themselves and mention how brave I'd been. Others kept their distance and seemed nervous around me. I could tell they were thinking about what had happened at my previous employer and wondering if I'd caused similar problems here. One nurse pulled me aside during a break and asked if the rumors were true about the hospital board trying to fire me. When I confirmed it, she just nodded and walked away without saying anything else. The shift was busy enough that I didn't have much time to worry about office politics. We had a car accident come in around midnight with 3 patients who needed immediate attention. Working alongside Zane again felt comfortable and familiar. He'd always been a solid doctor and a good friend. A letter arrived at my apartment about 2 weeks after I started the new job. The return address was a P.O. box in a state I'd never visited. I opened it carefully and recognized Maya's handwriting immediately. She wrote that she was doing okay in her new life. Therapy 3 times a week was helping her process everything that had happened. She'd started painting as a way to express feelings she couldn't put into words. Her therapist said it was a healthy outlet. She was enrolled in the school under her new identity and making friends slowly. She was cautious about getting close to people, but trying. She said some days were harder than others. Some nights, she still woke up screaming from nightmares. But overall, she felt like she was healing. She thanked me again for saving her life and giving her a chance at a real future. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer with the others she'd sent. Adriana called me on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 months into my new position. She sounded excited. The state legislature had just passed new mandatory reporting laws for medical professionals. The laws were specifically created because of Maya's case. They required doctors and nurses to report any suspected abuse immediately, with serious penalties for failure to comply. Maya had submitted written testimony supporting the legislation. Her words had been instrumental in getting it passed. Adriana said Maya's courage in speaking out had changed the system in a real way. Other victims would be protected now because of what she'd gone through. I thanked Adriana for calling to tell me. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and felt something like relief wash over me. Maybe all the pain and professional damage had been worth it if it meant other kids would be safer. 6 months after the trial ended, things finally started feeling normal again. The media attention had faded completely. Nobody recognized me in grocery stores anymore. I'd settled into my routine at the new hospital and built good working relationships with most of the staff. But I still had security cameras installed at my apartment. I still checked over my shoulder when I walked to my car at night. I still thought about Richard's death list sometimes and wondered if there were other people out there who blamed me for ruining their lives. The paranoia probably wouldn't ever go away completely. That was just part of the cost. Clara called me out of nowhere on a Saturday morning. She had news about Maya. Maya was doing well enough now that she'd started volunteering with an organization that supported other trafficking survivors. She was helping other girls who'd been through similar trauma. Clara said it was a sign of genuine healing when victims could turn their pain into purpose. Maya was using everything she'd learned in therapy to help others navigate their own recovery. She was only 17 now, but already making a difference in other people's lives. Clara's voice got emotional when she talked about how proud she was of Maya's progress. I told Clara to pass along my congratulations next time she talked to Maya. Another letter came exactly 1 year after the night Maya had arrived at my ER. I opened it on my lunch break at work. Maya wrote that she was genuinely happy for the first time in years. She had a real life now with people who cared about her. She had friends and hobbies and plans for the future. She was thinking about becoming a therapist herself someday so she could help other survivors. She said she was grateful every single day that I'd given her the chance to have a future instead of letting her die that night. She said knowing Richard and all the others were in prison helped her sleep better. She said she still had bad days, but the good days were starting to outnumber them. She signed the letter with her new name, the one she used in witness protection. I read it 3 times and then put it in my locker at work. I keep it there as a reminder that doing the right thing is worth whatever it costs, even when the cost feels too high to bear.